The frontier learned men slowly, through weather and waiting. By the time the sun rose over the high plains and painted the fences in copper light, the land already knew the rancher's name. He was 70 years carved into bone and habit. A man shaped by droughts that cracked the earth and winters that bent iron. His ranch spread wide as a held breath, grass rolling like a sea that never quite slept. Every fence post bore the memory of his hands, every windmill creaked with a voice he recognized as his own. He had not planned to marry again. The land had been enough for decades, a companion that demanded strength and returned silence. Yet time has a way of narrowing choices, and the years had pressed him toward a reckoning he could no longer postpone. The ranch needed more than fences and cattle. It needed a future that could outlive him. He was a man whose life had been measured in seasons, and the seasons were shortening. She arrived like a change in weather. The townsfolk called her the giant bride, though the name said more about their awe than her size. She was tall, yes, strong, shouldered and steady in her stride, but what truly set her apart was the way she seemed to take up space without apology. She carried herself with the calm of someone who had learned early how to stand alone. When she rode through town toward the ranch, dust followed her like a veil, and the sun caught in her hair as if it meant to stay. Her story had traveled ahead of her in fragments, orphaned young, raised among hands and herds, known for working longer than men twice her age, known, too, for refusing to be folded into small expectations. She had come not as a girl chasing romance, but as a woman answering a summons that promised work, shelter, and a place in a world that respected endurance. The marriage was arranged with plain words and fewer illusions. There were no whispered vows under lace canopies, no crowd to cheer. The land watched, the cattle watched, the sky leaned low and blue, indifferent and eternal. What passed between them was not passion but purpose, a shared understanding that some unions are forged not in fire but in stone. From the first day, the ranch tested her. Fences sagged where winter had gnawed them thin, calves bawled in the distance, demanding attention. The well-needed clearing, the south pasture rotation recalculated. She met each task with a steady gaze and a patience that surprised even the old rancher. He had expected strength. He had not expected grace. He observed from a distance at first, as he had learned to do with everything that mattered. Years had taught him caution. He noted how she listened before acting, how she weighed the land's moods. He saw how the hands responded to her, not with fear, but with an unspoken trust earned through competence. The ranch, too, seemed to accept her, yielding just enough to reward effort. At night, the house held its breath. The walls were thick with memory, and every floorboard remembered footsteps long gone. She moved through those rooms with care, aware that she was stepping into a history that was not her own. The oil lamps cast long shadows that stitched past to present, and the silence was deep enough to hear the ticking of time. The rancher felt the years most keenly then, not as regret but as weight. He knew what people said, knew how the town measured such unions with raised brows and quiet judgments. He did not blame them. The gap between them was as wide as the plains themselves. Yet he had learned that the land did not care for opinions. It cared for work done well and promises kept. He thought of legacy as he lay awake, of names written in ledgers and brands burned into hide. He thought of how quickly a lifetime could vanish without someone to remember the details. The ranch had outlived men before, swallowing their stories into grass and dust. He intended, stubbornly, that this place would not forget him. She, too, lay awake, listening to the wind move through cotton woods like a distant sea. She understood the bargain she had entered. She did not mistake security for affection, nor purpose for certainty. Yet she felt something else taking root. an awareness that her strength had found a place where it mattered. The ranch asked much of her, but it gave her something rare, belonging without diminishment. Days settled into rhythm. Mornings began with frost or heat, depending on the mood of the season. Work filled the hours, and the rancher found himself speaking less, watching more. He noticed how she learned the land's secrets quickly, how she remembered which creek swelled after storms, and which draws stayed dry. He saw the future in her hands, strong and capable, shaping what would come after him. The town continued to watch from a distance. Speculation drifted like smoke, thick with assumptions, but out on the ranch, beyond gossip and glances, something quieter was forming. Not love, as songs described it, but a partnership carved from necessity and respect. It was the kind of bond the frontier understood well, even if it rarely named it. As summer deepened, storms gathered on the horizon, tall and dark. The rancher stood beside her on the porch one evening, both of them watching lightning stitch the sky. He felt, for the first time in years, a sense of forward motion that did not exhaust him. The land hummed with promise and peril, as it always had. The storm broke that night, rain pounding the earth until dust turned to mud and creeks sang. The ranch drank deeply. When morning came, the world smelled new, and the grass shone with life. It felt like a beginning disguised as routine. Neither of them spoke of what lay ahead. They did not need to. The land would decide much, as it always did. But as the sun rose over the wet plains, casting long shadows across a ranch poised between past and future, it was clear that this union, unusual, scrutinized, purposeful, had set something in motion that could not easily be undone. And with the ground softened by rain and the air heavy with possibility, the story of what this marriage would demand and what it might yet give was only just beginning, waiting for the next chapter to claim its ground. Autumn arrived without ceremony, as it always did on the plains, slipping into the days with cooler mornings and evenings that carried the smell of smoke. The ranch responded first. Grass stiffened, insects quieted, and the cattle moved with a deliberate calm that spoke of instincts older than fences. The marriage, too, began to reveal its shape under the pressure of routine, less an event than a process unfolding one measured day at a time. The giant bride learned the ranch as one learns a language, not by memorizing words, but by listening to rhythm. She read the sky with the same focus she gave the ledger, noting how clouds gathered before cold fronts and how the wind shifted just ahead of change. Her strength became less spectacle and more certainty, woven into the daily work until it felt inevitable. The hands followed her lead without needing instruction, drawn to the steadiness that marked every decision. The rancher watched this transformation with a mixture of relief and awe. He had spent a lifetime preparing the land for a future he would not see clearly, and now that future was taking form in front of him. He found himself stepping back where once he would have insisted on control. It was not surrender, but trust hard, won and quietly given. The house changed as well. Rooms that had been preserved like memories began to breathe again. Windows were opened, curtains washed. A sense of movement replaced the careful stillness that had defined the place for years. The walls, once heavy with absence, now carried the soft evidence of continuity. Even the clocks seemed to tick with renewed purpose. The town noticed the difference. Supplies were ordered with precision. Cattle arrived at market in better condition than anyone expected after the dry summer. Rumors softened into grudging respect. People spoke less about the strangeness of the match and more about the ranch, its renewed vigor. The giant bride's name was no longer followed by speculation alone, but by acknowledgment. Winter tested them early. A sudden storm swept down from the north, bringing snow that fell thick and fast, erasing boundaries and turning familiar paths into uncertain ground. The rancher felt the ache in his joints before the first flakes touched earth, a reminder that time had not loosened its grip. Yet he did not feel helpless. The ranch was ready, prepared by months of work, guided by younger strength and sharper foresight. They faced the storm not as individuals, but as a unit shaped by shared responsibility. Supplies were rationed carefully, livestock sheltered where possible. Long nights passed with the wind howling against the walls, the world narrowed to lamplight and endurance. In those hours, something unspoken settled between them, a recognition that survival itself could be a form of intimacy. The rancher reflected often during that winter, his thoughts circling the idea of legacy like a wary horse. He understood legacy not as blood alone, but as continuity, the passing on of knowledge, the preservation of values that could outlast flesh. He saw in her the capacity to carry that forward, to hold the ranch steady through changes he could no longer fight. It was a comfort that surprised him with its depth. She, in turn, grappled with the weight of expectation. The role she had accepted grew heavier as winter wore on. The land demanded foresight, the people demanded leadership, and the future pressed close, insistent and undefined. Yet she did not shrink. The ranch had become a place where her strength mattered, where her choices shaped outcomes. That sense of purpose anchored her against doubt. Spring came late, hesitant and fragile. Snow lingered in shaded draws, and the earth released its grip slowly. When green finally pushed through the brown, it did so with a vigor that felt earned. Calving season followed, relentless and hopeful, filling the days with vigilance and the nights with restless waiting. Life asserted itself everywhere, fragile and determined. The giant bride moved through this season with quiet authority. She anticipated needs before they became crises, adjusted plans as conditions shifted, and held the balance between caution and boldness with remarkable ease. The rancher found himself learning from her, a reversal that carried no shame. Wisdom, he realized, was not a fixed possession, but a current that flowed where it was needed most. The town's attitude shifted fully then. Visitors came not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Deals were struck with a confidence that reflected trust in the ranch's leadership. The giant bride stood at the center of this change, not as a novelty, but as a force that had reshaped the landscape of expectation. Yet beneath the progress lay tension, subtle but persistent. The future loomed large, its shape still uncertain. The rancher felt the urgency of time more keenly with each passing month. The land was thriving, the partnership solid, but questions remained unanswered. How would the legacy be secured? What form would continuity take when his strength finally failed? She sensed this unease even when it went unspoken. The ranch had taught her to read signs, weather, animals, people, and she understood that some storms gathered slowly. The bond between them had grown from necessity into something steadier, forged by shared trials and mutual reliance. It was not affection as the world romanticized it, but it was real and it carried weight. As summer approached once more, the plains stretched wide and green under an open sky. The ranch stood stronger than it had in years, a testament to resilience and adaptation. Yet the story was far from settled. The seasons had proven that survival was possible, even thriving, but the deeper question of what would endure remained unanswered. With the land humming with life and the horizon offering no clear boundary between past and future, the next turning of their story waited just beyond the heat of summer, ready to test the limb. It's of purpose, promise, and the meaning of legacy itself. By the third year, the ranch no longer felt like a project under repair. It had become a living system again, balanced and alert, its needs anticipated before they rose to urgency. The land responded to careful stewardship with a generosity that bordered on grace. Grass thickened in the low pastures. Water held longer in the draws. The cattle carried weight through winter without strain. These were not accidents, but outcomes shaped by vigilance and respect. The rancher measured time now in smaller units, not years or seasons, but moments when his breath caught or his hands trembled after a long day. He noticed the narrowing of his strength without panic. What concerned him more was clarity, whether he had done enough to prepare the ranch for the day when his presence would no longer anchor it. He had seen too many empires of fence and soil crumble, because no one had been ready to take the weight when the old hands let go. The giant bride carried that weight more visibly with each passing month. Her authority was no longer provisional. It was assumed. Decisions flowed through her without resistance, and the ranch responded as if it recognized her as a fixed point. She had learned not only the land's moods, but its history, the places where previous owners had failed, the corners where ambition had outpaced wisdom. She treated those lessons with reverence, honoring mistakes as carefully as successes. The idea of continuity pressed closer then, shaping the air around them. It was present in the way the rancher lingered over records late into the night, tracing lines of ownership and labor that stretched back farther than memory. It was present in the way she walked the boundaries, not to measure them, but to understand their meaning. The ranch was more than acreage. It was a promise that required guardianship. The town sensed this shift as well. Conversations turned toward the future with a seriousness that had been absent before. Neighbors asked about long-term plans, about investments and transitions. They no longer spoke of the marriage as an oddity. They spoke of it as a strategy that had worked. Respect, once hesitant, settled into certainty. Summer arrived with a heat that tested endurance. Days stretched long and bright, and the work demanded precision. Mistakes under such conditions could cost lives, human or animal. The giant bride met this pressure with a calm that steadied everyone around her. She adjusted schedules, conserved resources, and pushed when pushing was necessary. The rancher observed, offering guidance when asked, but trusting her judgment even when it diverged from his own. It was during this season that the question of legacy sharpened into something unavoidable. The rancher felt the narrowing of options with the clarity that only age brings. He understood that continuity required more than management. It required a vision that extended beyond a single lifetime. He considered structures that might outlast him, trusts, agreements, plans etched into paper, yet he knew that documents alone could not carry the soul of a place. She understood this too. The land had taught her that survival depended on more than strength. It depended on succession, the passing of knowledge, values, and responsibility from one generation to the next. Whether through blood or bond, continuity demanded intention. She felt the weight of that responsibility settling into her bones, not as burden, but as calling. The rancher began to share more then, stories that had never been written down, lessons learned through failure and loss. He spoke of droughts that had nearly broken him, of winters that had taken friends and stock alike. These were not confessions but offerings, pieces of hard-earned wisdom placed carefully into her keeping. She received them with seriousness, understanding that such knowledge was a form of inheritance. Autumn followed with its familiar shift, cooling the air and sharpening focus. Preparations were made early, guided by foresight rather than fear. The ranch entered winter stronger than ever, its systems refined and resilient. The giant bride stood at the center of this readiness, her presence a constant reassurance that nothing essential had been overlooked. The rancher felt a quiet satisfaction in this. He had not lost his purpose. It had simply transformed. Where once he had carried everything alone, now he shared the load with someone capable of carrying it forward. This sharing did not diminish him. It completed something he had not realized was unfinished. Yet the future still demanded definition. The land thrived, the partnership endured, but the shape of what would come next remained open. Continuity, the rancher knew, was not automatic. It required deliberate choice, a commitment that reached beyond comfort into responsibility. He sensed that the next step would ask more of both of them than any season had so far. As winter settled in once more, the ranch stood quiet under a pale sky. The cattle were sheltered, the fences firm, the house warm with lamplight. Everything appeared settled, yet beneath the surface, a turning point approached. The decisions ahead would determine not only who worked the land, but how its story would be carried forward. With the year closing and the future pressing close, the ranch waited steady, patient for the moment when intention would harden into destiny, and the next chapter of its life would demand to be written. The fourth year arrived with a sense of tightening focus, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and held it. The ranch stood orderly and resilient, its rhythms refined by experience and foresight. Nothing about its strength was accidental anymore. Each pasture rotation, each repair, each decision carried the imprint of a partnership that had learned to anticipate consequences. The work no longer felt like recovery, it felt like stewardship. The rancher moved more slowly now, his body negotiating terms with each dawn. He had accepted these negotiations without bitterness. Slowness, he discovered, brought clarity. He noticed things he once hurried past. The way dew settled differently on the north slope, the quiet communication among the cattle as they shifted together, the subtle signals that told him when weather would break. Age had narrowed his reach but sharpened his sight. The giant bride stood at the center of the ranch's daily motion, her presence anchoring effort and intention. She had grown into the role not by claiming it, but by earning it repeatedly. People deferred to her judgment because it proved reliable. The land responded because she listened before acting. Her strength was no longer a curiosity. It was a given, as integral to the ranch as water and grass. Between them, the unspoken understanding deepened. They had passed beyond the early caution that marks new alliances. Trust now moved freely, shaped by shared trials and steady outcomes. They did not need constant confirmation of purpose. The work itself provided proof. Each season completed without crisis reinforced the certainty that this arrangement had become something enduring. The question of the future, however, refused to remain abstract. It pressed into conversations with neighbors, into the careful attention given to records and boundaries, into the way the rancher began to delegate responsibilities he once held close. He understood that preparation was not a single act, but a series of choices made consistently over time. The land demanded continuity, and continuity demanded intention. She felt this pressure as well, though she experienced it differently. For her, the future was not a narrowing corridor, but a widening field. She saw possibilities in the ranch, as renewed strength, opportunities to expand carefully, to invest in resilience rather than scale. She imagined systems that could withstand droughts and downturns, structures that could protect both people and land when conditions turned harsh. Her vision was practical, grounded in the realities she had learned to respect. Spring brought challenges that tested this vision. Unpredictable rains alternated with sudden heat, confusing growth patterns and straining livestock. The ranch required constant adjustment, and decisions had to be made quickly, sometimes without precedent. She navigated these uncertainties with a steady hand, drawing on both experience and intuition. The rancher observed with quiet pride, recognizing the maturity of her judgment. The town's relationship with the ranch evolved further during this time. Where once it had been a subject of speculation, it now served as a reference point. Others sought advice, asked questions, watched closely. The ranch had become an example of adaptation, done right, of how tradition and change could coexist without erasing one another. This attention brought responsibility, and both felt its weight. Summer arrived heavy and bright, its days stretching long and demanding. The ranch operated at full capacity, every system engaged. The rancher found himself stepping back more often, not from disinterest, but from confidence. He trusted the structures they had built together. He trusted her leadership. This trust freed him to consider the broader arc of his life, to reflect on what he would leave behind beyond land and ledgers. He began to think less about control and more about influence. The lessons he passed on now were not instructions, but principles, ways of thinking shaped by decades of experience. He shared stories not to assert authority, but to offer context. She received these stories as tools, fitting them into her own understanding of the land and its demands. Autumn returned with its familiar clarity, the air sharpening and the work narrowing to essentials. Preparations for winter were thorough, guided by lessons learned in earlier years. The ranch entered the cold season with confidence, its reserves strong and its systems tested. There was satisfaction in this readiness, a sense that effort had been translated into security. Yet beneath this stability, a turning point approached. Both sensed it, though neither named it directly. The rancher felt the urgency of time with increasing clarity. He knew that endurance required more than maintenance. It required a decision about succession that could not be postponed indefinitely. The giant bride, too, felt the gravity of what lay ahead. Stewardship, she understood, would soon demand a deeper commitment. Winter settled in with a quiet intensity, snow covering the land in clean, unforgiving lines. The ranch stood firm against the cold, its strength evident in every sheltered animal and reinforced structure. Inside the house, lamplight carved warm spaces against the darkness. The atmosphere was one of reflection rather than tension, of preparation rather than fear. As the year closed, the sense of an ending intertwined with the promise of a beginning. The ranch had reached a point of stability that allowed for choice, and choice carried consequence. The decisions made next would define not only ownership, but identity, how the land's story would be told long after the present actors had faded. With the snow deepening and the nights stretching long, the ranch waited in a stillness that felt deliberate. The work had been done, the foundation was set. What remained was the moment when intention would become irrevocable, and the path forward would be chosen, opening the way for the final chapters of this story to take shape. The 5th year opened with a winter that refused to loosen its grip. Snow lingered well past its usual retreat, pressing the land into a long, reflective pause. The ranch endured, but endurance now felt different, less like resistance and more like proof. Every fence that held, every animal that came through strong, spoke of preparation finally tested by time itself. The rancher felt the year settle into his bones. The cold lingered there longer than it once had, and recovery came slowly after even modest exertion. He no longer pretended otherwise. What surprised him was not the limitation, but the calm acceptance that followed it. The work he once measured in hours, he now measured in outcomes, trusting systems rather than strength. It was a shift he had resisted for years, now embraced without regret. The giant bride moved through this prolonged winter with a steadiness that reassured everyone around her. She adjusted operations to conserve energy and resources, made careful decisions about risk, and ensured that nothing essential was left to chance. The ranch did not merely survive the extended cold, it adapted. The land seemed to recognize her intention, yielding just enough to reward discipline. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew quieter, more contemplative. The long nights invited reflection, and reflection brought clarity. The rancher spent hours reviewing records, not with anxiety but with purpose. He saw patterns emerge, years of effort coalescing into a structure that could stand without him. This realization carried both relief and a subtle ache, the recognition that completion often resembles departure. For the giant bride, this period deepened her understanding of responsibility. Stewardship, she realized, was not only about making decisions, but about standing with their consequences. The ranch's stability rested increasingly on her judgment, and she felt the gravity of that truth settle firmly. Yet she did not feel burdened. The land had become an extension of her will, and caring for it felt as natural as breathing. When spring finally broke through, it did so with urgency. Meltwater surged through draws and creeks, demanding attention and quick action. The ranch responded with practiced efficiency. Adjustments were made without panic, guided by experience accumulated over years of shared labor. The rancher watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the transition he had prepared for was already well underway. The town noticed the shift, too. Conversations changed tone, becoming less speculative and more definitive. People spoke of the ranch's future as a certainty rather than a question. Deals were negotiated with long horizons in mind, and trust extended naturally toward the giant bride's leadership. The rancher's presence was still respected, but it was no longer the sole axis around which everything turned. Summer brought abundance tempered by caution. The land yielded generously, but not without reminders of its unpredictability. Sudden storms tested structures, and heat demanded vigilance. The giant bride managed these challenges with the same calm authority that had become her hallmark. The rancher offered guidance when needed, but more often observed, content to see his knowledge applied through another's hands. During this season, the question of legacy crystallized into something tangible. The rancher understood that continuity required a clear line, not just of ownership, but of intent. He began to formalize what had long been implicit, ensuring that the values shaping the ranch would be protected alongside its assets. This work was meticulous, deliberate, and deeply personal. She participated fully in this process, not as a passive recipient, but as a collaborator. She understood that accepting stewardship meant accepting accountability. The ranch's future would reflect her decisions as much as his past efforts. This understanding strengthened her resolve, grounding her vision in humility as well as confidence. Autumn arrived with a sense of culmination. The work of the year came together smoothly, each task reinforcing the stability they had built. Harvests were completed efficiently, livestock prepared carefully for winter. The ranch entered the colder months strong and organized, its systems refined to a level that left little room for doubt. The rancher felt a profound sense of completion, then not an ending, but a fulfillment. He had given the land what he could, shaped it with intention and care. Now he could see, clearly and without illusion, that it was ready to continue without him at the center. This realization did not diminish him. It validated the life he had spent building something meant to last. The giant bride felt this transition as well, sensing the shift in responsibility become permanent. The ranch was no longer something she managed alongside him. It was something she would carry forward. The weight of that truth settled firmly, accompanied by a quiet pride. She had not sought this role for recognition, but for purpose, and now purpose stood clearly defined. As winter approached once more, the land settled into a familiar stillness. Snow threatened, but had not yet fallen, and the air held a sharp clarity that felt almost ceremonial. The ranch stood ready, its future outlined with intention and care. With the year drawing to a close and the final decisions nearly set, the story reached a threshold. What remained was not uncertainty, but acceptance, the moment when preparation gives way to continuity. Beyond this point lay the culmination of years of effort, where legacy would no longer be an idea, but a living reality, waiting for the final chapter to give it voice. The final year unfolded quietly, without spectacle, as if the land itself understood the significance of restraint. There were no dramatic storms to announce a turning point, no sudden calamities to force change. Instead, there was steadiness, a calm continuity that felt earned. The ranch moved through its days with practiced certainty, each task flowing into the next as naturally as breath. The rancher woke later now, his mornings unhurried. He no longer measured his worth by the hours he worked, but by the clarity with which the ranch continued in his absence. From the porch, he watched the land come alive under another's direction. He saw cattle moved efficiently, fences inspected before they failed, water managed with foresight rather than reaction. These were small things, perhaps, but together they formed the proof he had long sought. His body reminded him daily of its limits, yet his mind felt lighter than it had in years. The burden of vigilance, the constant need to anticipate disaster had eased. What remained was observation, reflection, and a quiet satisfaction that bordered on peace. He had not abandoned the land, he had entrusted it. The giant bride carried the ranch forward with confidence shaped by humility. She understood now that leadership was not dominance, but alignment, bringing people, animals, and land into a shared rhythm. Her decisions were firm but measured, informed by the lessons she had inherited and the realities she faced daily. The ranch responded with loyalty, its systems holding strong under her care. Spring returned gently that year. Grass rose evenly across the pastures, water flowed where it was meant to, and calving season passed without major loss. The land seemed to reward patience, offering abundance without excess. The rancher noted this balance with a knowing smile. Prosperity, he understood, was not about taking everything the land could give, but about taking only what could be sustained. The town recognized the transition fully now. The ranch's identity had shifted, and with it, the community's perception. The giant bride was no longer seen through the lens of novelty or speculation. She was regarded as the ranch's rightful steward, her authority unquestioned. The rancher remained respected, but his role had changed from pillar to foundation, still essential, but no longer visible in every movement. Summer arrived with its familiar demands, but the ranch met them without strain. Systems refined over years functioned smoothly, and contingencies were ready when needed. The rancher offered counsel sparingly, more as a sounding board than a director. He found satisfaction in watching ideas he once shaped now evolve independently, adapted to new circumstances by capable hands. As the days shortened and autumn approached, the sense of culmination deepened. The rancher reviewed the final documents, ensuring that everything he valued, land, principles, responsibilities, was secured. This work was done without haste, each decision considered carefully. When it was finished, he felt no anxiety, only relief. The future no longer pressed against him. It moved forward on its own. The giant bride accepted this responsibility fully, understanding that stewardship was not an endpoint, but a commitment renewed daily. She did not see herself as replacing the rancher, but as continuing what he had begun, guided by the same respect for the land and those who depended on it. The ranch's story would go on, shaped by her choices, informed by his legacy. Winter arrived softly, snow settling like a benediction rather than a threat. The ranch stood quiet and secure, its strength evident in every sheltered animal and well-maintained structure. Inside the house, lamplight glowed warmly, illuminating a space that felt complete rather than empty. The rancher spent more time in reflection then, not on what he had lost, but on what had endured. He understood that the land remembered effort, patience, and care. It carried those memories forward, embedding them into its rhythms. He had become part of that memory, not as a name etched into records alone, but as a presence woven into the very soil. The giant bride walked the boundaries one evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plains. She felt the weight of continuity settle comfortably, no longer heavy but grounding. The ranch was alive with promise, its future open and resilient. She understood that her role was not to control that future, but to guide it responsibly, honoring both past and possibility. As the year closed, the ranch rested in a stillness that felt intentional. There was no sense of ending, only transition, a passing of guardianship from one season of life to the next. The land stood ready to continue, shaped by those who had loved it through labor and respect. And so the story did not conclude with finality, but with assurance. The ranch endured, its legacy was secure, carried forward not by force or demand, but by commitment freely given and carefully upheld. In the vast silence of the plains, beneath a sky that had witnessed generations, the land held its memory and its future, steady and unbroken.